In this video, we're going to think about the changing ideas about evolution over time, because Darwin did not work alone. He didn't start the idea of thinking about evolution, and he did not finish it. So let's have a look. Our learning intention is that we will understand how scientific theories are developed, and we will, by the end of this video, hopefully be able to make some judgments about the roles that different scientists play in developing the theory of evolution, and have plenty of evidence that we can use to build our argument. So when we have a look at this little ribbon, if we start off way at the beginning, evolutionary theory, there are lots of early ideas about the theory of evolution, and then as we move through this timeline, you will notice there are many names that take us all the way up to 1859, which was when Darwin published his book on the origin of the species, and then we will consider some things that have happened since then. So let's have a think about the early ideas, because there were many ideas that existed about how species originated well before Charles Darwin's time. Early ideas include the dream time used by Aboriginal Australians. They describe the creation of Earth and life by ancestral beings. And one Dreamtime myth that is well known is the rainbow serpent, and this is thought by many Aboriginal cultures to have risen out of the ground, creating mountains, rivers, lakes, and living things. In fact, recorded in 6,000-year-old rock, the rainbow serpent is today one of the oldest religious beliefs in the world. There were also early ideas from Greek philosophers. This is Aristotle, and he was around 500 years before Christ, and he thought that life arose from mud when the earth was covered in water, and it then moved onto dry land. There is a Chinese myth, which is recorded in the 3rd century, of a hairy giant who emerged from an egg-shaped universe, and the egg formed the earth and the sky, and the hairs on this giant's body formed the trees and the plants, and the human life, get this, came from fleas on his body. And then this chap, James Usher, he was an archbishop, and he calculated that the earth must be about 6,000 years old, because he used all the examples in the Bible of different timelines, and he worked out that the earth was created by God about 4,000 years before Jesus was born. Carl Linnaeus was a Swedish scientist, and he is famous for classifying many living things. He developed the binomial system for naming living organisms, and he believed that God created all species, but his groupings of species, by classifying them into different groups, helped Charles Darwin and his grandfather Erasmus to develop their ideas about evolution. So this is the first time that we're actually allowing a scientist to have their ideas built upon by Darwin. Georges de Buffon was a French naturalist, so he was a person who went out and looked at nature, and he had controversial ideas that one species could change into another, and he believed they came from a common ancestor, so he was the first to bring forward this idea of a common ancestor. And he actually was the first to say that human and apes were related, but he retracted his ideas because they went against the church, and he got a lot of pressure about that. Erasmus Darwin was actually Charles Darwin's grandfather, and he was a doctor, a poet, an inventor, a scientist. He liked his food. I like this fact that they actually cut a semicircle out of his dining room table to fit his large stomach. That's pretty cool. And in his book, he proposed a book called Zoonomia, and he had actually some ideas about evolution. And he said that a species can evolve over millions of ages, and that life came from a single common ancestor, and that the species change because of competition for resources. So this should be starting to ring a bell. And remember, that this guy, Erasmus Darwin, is Charles Darwin's grandfather. So it makes sense that we're starting to feel some echoes of what's about to come. But quite famous is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck was the first scientist to come up with a theory of how species evolve. He wasn't quite right, but that's okay. That's how science works. And he believed that living things change in their lifetime because they respond to their environment and they pass these changes onto their offspring. If we think about what he means by that, what he said when he was describing giraffes was he said that giraffes change during their lifetime from having a short neck to a long neck because they try to reach the higher food in the trees and they stretch their neck and they keep stretching it and it becomes longer and then they give birth to babies with longer necks. It's not quite right. He also thought that features were lost or weakened if you didn't use them. So that's how he explained kind of blind cave fish. Could this be true? If we think about some bizarre examples, if you're a weightlifter and you get some big muscles, do you then have a baby who has big muscles? Now, when he reached the end of his life, Lamarck was pretty poor. And his theory, which was called inheritance by acquired characteristics, isn't quite how we understand evolution to work now. But there are actually some bits of his ideas that we do actually understand in modern genetics today. So you can explore some of these links to find out a little bit more. So then we get to Charles Darwin. So we're in the mid-1800s now, and Charles Darwin, obviously famous for his theory of evolution by natural selection. He started out by studying medicine. He actually literally couldn't stomach it. He didn't like all the medical bits. He went to study in Cambridge to be a clergyman, and then he changed his mind again, and he went and took a job being the nature guy on HMS Beagle. He actually was a big friend of a guy called Charles Lyle, and Charles Lyle was a geologist, and he was the first person to really say that there was enough time for all this gradual change to happen. So there's geological features change over huge spans of time, is what Lyle said, and this now gives an understanding of the age of the Earth, which might give time for some of these gradual changes that Darwin is going to talk about, actually gives them time to happen. So Darwin actually took Charles Lyell's book called Principles of Geology on the Beagle with him to have a read, a bit of bedtime reading. So on the Beagle, which is the boat that Charles Darwin was employed as a naturalist on, Darwin's job was to record the plants and the animals on that voyage. They went to South America, they went via the Galapagos Islands, and Darwin noticed differences between the beaks of finches on different islands, and he wondered if it was due to the differences of food on each island. From his observations, he started to form ideas about evolution, and actually Darwin visited Australia. He actually got off the boat and went for a bit of a tour around bits of Australia. He went up into the Blue Mountains, went to the Wentworth Falls and things like that. But at about the same time, we got Alfred Russel Wallace, and he was travelling around the world as well, just different places. So he had been to the Amazon and to Asia, and he was coming up with a theory very similar to Darwin's, but separate to Darwin. He wasn't using Darwin's data, he was using his own data. And in 1858, Wallace sent a paper to Darwin asking him to publish his theory and kind of give his ideas a read. Now, Darwin had developed his theory on return to London, but he hadn't published it yet. And then when he heard from Wallace, which was kind of 20 years after he got back, Darwin was kind of stirred into action, and he was like, yes, my ideas do have credibility. And he became quite bold. He knew that it was going to be controversial, but he decided that they would present their ideas together. So Darwin publishes his book, which is called On the Origin of the Species by Natural Selection, and it contains all the evidence that Darwin collected. His theory really doesn't go down well. It was ridiculed because it went against Christian beliefs. But but there's mounting evidence that it was a good way of explaining how evolution happens. And since that has been published, there is a lot of what's called neo-Darwinism, which means new Darwinism, because today we know about DNA, we know about genetics, we can look for evidence alongside all the other evidence for evolution that includes now genetic information, and we can see that organisms really are related and how mutations actually allow differences that can then be acted upon by differences in the environment. So hopefully you've seen how information, scientists use information that's already out there. They build on ideas. They try to knock down or prove or disprove other people's ideas. And in doing so, you collect a body of evidence that, alongside other experimenters, starts to form a widely accepted explanation for how something happens. And that is how we develop a theory.